Okay, so first I'm just going to introduce a little bit about myself. I am a registered dietitian and officially also a diabetes educator. I live in Lakewood, New Jersey, moving to Highland Park actually this summer. I have started out in the hospital setting, the nursing home setting, working a lot with individuals, with diabetes, weight management. But what I had started to notice was that there was a big need that was not filled within specifically the Frum community as well. We all know IBD is rampant in our community, and there was no person to speak up and give support nutritionally to answer people's questions. People just didn't know what to do. They were told by their doctors what to do medically, but there was nobody to support people nutritionally and answer their questions, let them know what to do. And honestly, even within the nutritional world, there's not much info about nutrition out there. So with, all my friends and relatives out there and people I know with IBD, they would start to approach me and they had different questions. And what I would go ahead and do is look in the studies and look in the research. And I began to develop an interest in this field. And what started to happen was that as I developed an interest and started to research this and develop more protocols and speak with people in the field, it became just something that just boomeranged. And within time, I had people calling me from all over, and this is now my special niche. And I'm hoping that you guys will go ahead and learn something today from this. At the end, I'm going to be taking any questions, so feel free at the end if you want to, talk to me privately in the back. Or I also have, Shauna, do you have a mic? Do you have that mic? Okay, so I'll be handing that out in the back as well, at the end as well. Okay, so I'm going to be going through this with you. I'm going to ask if there's any questions, if you can wait till the end, okay? Okay, so evidence-based practice, and in the booklet that you have on your chair is handouts of all the slides that are presented over here. Okay, so evidence-based practice is basically what I'm just starting to discuss this because this is very important for you to understand that I'm not making things up here. So evidence-based practice means that in every field, specifically it started within medicine, we always go ahead and we don't just make things up for our clients. We want to give you the best treatment based on studies and research, okay? So it's, I gave the definition from Wikipedia over here, but basically what it means is that we give you the best available research, okay? We have to apply a little bit of clinical judgment, okay? Obviously there's within, whatever parameters there are, but we have to use a little bit of clinical judgment to try to figure out within the research what would be best for a specific scenario. And then as well, we also have to take into account people's preferences and values, which you'll see how that applies to specifically what I do. Meaning there's a lot of different approaches nutritionally, what you can do for Crohn's and colitis, and you want to take into account what works for people, okay? Meaning if there's a lot of different ways that we can treat this nutritionally, if somebody's open to trying one route first, I'll usually go with that first. Okay, so getting more into what we're going to be doing today, I have a little outline. I want to talk a little bit about the gut microbiome. I don't know how many of you have heard about that, but that's basically the balance of bacteria that's in the gut, and it plays a very central role in the pathogenesis, meaning the whole disease process of IBD. I want to talk. Based on that, I want to bring out practicalities, what you can do about it. So I'm going to be talking about specific probiotic strains that I find very helpful. I also want to talk about, this is not usually a route most of my clients take, but for anybody out here that would be interested in this, there is a route, an approach that says that you can bring into remission IBD with an enteral diet. Enteral diet means a liquid diet for 3 to 4 weeks, which most of my clients don't take that route. But it is an approach. Some people do, just for people that are, desperate, it is an approach. I want to talk about, that's the big thing nowadays, food proteins like gluten and other proteins, dairy, egg, whatever it is, and how they can be connected to IBD. Yeast as well. Specific supplements we're going to go through, and if there's any evidence to support it. I was actually surprised in the process of researching for this presentation. Something that I had thought was based on good enough evidence, when I evaluated it and looked through the studies, I don't think it's supported well enough. So, you always want it to be backed up by research. And then we want to go through, which most of you have heard about, I'm sure, the SCD diet. I'm going to go through a little bit about that in detail, but I also want to go through some other approaches as well, which is the GAPS approach and the Paleo approach, okay? So getting started, to start about the gut microbiome, okay? So what the gut microbiome is basically, it is the combination of all the different types of microbes that are in the gut. In our intestines, we have about over 1,000 species of different microbes, okay? And these microbes are extremely important to our immune function and our digestive process. And they're very actually helpful for us. If we didn't have these microbes in our gut, a lot of them actually break down the foods that we eat, and they produce different compounds that are very healthy for us, okay? They also they help us produce a lot of immune compounds. By being there, by having the right species in your gut, you function differently. They're finding now, I'm sure you've heard all the research going on, that people with different species of bacteria in their gut have weight management issues, and some are more likely to develop diabetes. So these are not just innocuous little creatures living in us, they actually are playing a central role to our health, okay? And if your immune system doesn't develop a good relationship with these little guys in your gut, it doesn't work very well. So basically what they've found is that it's very clear, this is clear as day, everybody has found this across the board, that people with IBD, people with Crohn's and colitis, have different amounts of bacteria in their gut than healthy people. When they take two groups of people and they analyze them side by side, they can see changes that are very clear between the bacterial colonies in people with IBD and the people without, okay? So what they're speculating, and there's a lot of research going on, is that IBD is basically the central, what starts the process. They're not clear if the process starts from not having the right bacteria or if that's just a result from, but it appears to be more that that's more the cause. Okay, so we'll know more probably in 5 to 10 years, but it appears to be that when those bacterial colonies get out of whack, that's what appears to cause this whole disease process to begin. So IBD, they believe, results from an altered immune response between the bacteria in the gut and the individual. Okay? I don't know if anybody's heard about the Human Microbiome Project. You have heard about it? Okay. So the Human Genome Project was a very famous project that went on for many years, and now they've extended it to the Human Microbiome Project. The NIH, it's a huge initiative. What they want to do is they want to basically identify all the different species of bacteria that reside in the human gut. This is a huge project just because there's so many of them, and we know the basics. I mean, you take a probiotic, there's 10 strains in there. We know certain ones are good for health, but there's so much more out there that we don't know. What they want to be able to do is to say, okay, this strain is associated with this disease. So if this is a little low in somebody, they want to be able to characterize and eventually one day look at the species of bacteria in the human gut and be able to say, this is what you're lacking, take this, and people will hopefully see treatment and results from it. So that's underway in process. There's going to be more developments in that in the future, but it just goes to show you how central this is to our health. Just proving my point with some research. I mean, I could have gone on and on with this, but in the interest of time, I just kept it to about 2 studies. When they looked at the gut microbiota, which means the balance of bacteria in children with ulcerative colitis versus healthy children, they saw less diversity. Less diversity means there's less different types of strains. You have more, instead of harboring, they're not testing all of them, but they have seen that with the ones that they've tested, it's less diverse. More diversity is associated with better health. There are actually stool tests that I do with my clients that you can easily see if your stool is considered has a diverse gut microbiota, and that's associated with health. Almost all the time nowadays, I don't even do that test, it's a waste of money, because if somebody has Crohn's or colitis, they've got a low diverse microbiota. The question is, where do you go from there? That's what we're going to try to answer. So, and they did notice even that non-responders within this group to steroid treatment had even lower bacterial diversity. So obviously it plays a very important role, the diverseness and the richness of the microbiota. Also another study I pointed out here, and I put all the references on the bottom if anybody has a medical background. I tried to aim this to the layperson, but if you are interested, you can look up the research yourself. Once another study found adults with active Crohn's disease had less diversity, so this is definitely, we know that this is a main central component of IBD. So where do we go from here? I want you to take away something practical. It's very, very important to be taking probiotics. We all know that, but nobody really knows yet which strain is important to heal which disease state. What I wanted to do was look through the studies and say, have they done any research on any of these specific probiotics that are on the market, and have they ever actually seen that individuals who took it saw improvement in their Crohn's and colitis symptoms? So Culturelle, anybody heard of Culturelle? It's a very famous probiotic. That's a very, very famously studied strain of probiotic. Probably the most studies done on this strain than any other strain out there. And sure enough, when they actually did it was a pilot study. It wasn't, they needed to do a controlled trial, we call it. But when they did a pilot study, they saw that children and adults that had a more mild to moderate, stable Crohn's disease saw improvement in their Crohn's scores when they score how active the disease is. So cultural might be something that you'd want to consider. In fact, with my clients, I usually put them on 3 different types of probiotics to make sure they're getting in all the different types of strains. This test that I do, which you can do it as well, the test if you want to look up a local doctor that can do it, it's Genova Diagnostics. I didn't have that written down, but after the lecture you can come over to me and I'll give you the name of that again. They can test actually, if you look at this slide on bullet point 2, there's different groups of bacteria in the gut, and they kind of group it by different class. What they found is that people who have Crohn's and colitis generally tend to have higher levels of bacteroids. It's a certain bad strain of bacteria in their gut, and reduced levels of firmicutes, okay? So whatever that's supposed to mean, you don't have to know that, but the point is that there is a certain, specifically a probiotic, and I gave you the phone number in the slides, that has those strains, those firmicutes. It's Bacillus. It's a very hard strain to find. When you go to your health food store and you look at the label on your probiotics, it most likely does not include these 2 strains, Bacillus. These are very important strains like I said over here, they've done some research on it in mice, and it's very promising, and they're trying to do some research on it in humans, okay? And there's another specific strain that I recommend in IBD called Bifidobacterium longum, that they did a study that when they gave that to individuals combined with a prebiotic. Prebiotic is, you can get that in the health food store. It's basically food for bacteria. When they combined that, they saw complete improvements in the whole, in inflammation and in ulceration and everything. And it also actually helped revive the cells of the intestinal lining. So definitely everybody with IBD needs to be on probiotics. That alone is not going to do it. But I'm just saying that's an adjunct therapy. That's something that you should definitely be making sure that you do, okay? Another thing that I always like to point out is that it's nice to take pills in a bottle and strains of bacteria in a bottle, and it has to be high quality. I always recommend the refrigerated versions that are assured to be alive when they get to your intestines and survive the stomach acid. But it's even more, for centuries, people didn't have probiotics in a bottle, but how did they make sure that their gut were colonized by healthy species? Is that they were eating fermented foods for centuries. So I always encourage people, particularly with IBS and IBD both, to make sure that they're including fermented foods. So yogurt is we all know that, but there's also sauerkraut, kefir. There's a lot of fermented foods out there. There's even a brand of pickles that I buy at home. It's called Bubby's Pickles. They sell it in the fridge. You're familiar with it? Okay. So that's a fermented, they make the pickles actually just through the natural fermentation process. It's aged. Okay, so that's something that you always want to try to make sure that you include fermented foods as part of your diet. I wasn't sure whether to discuss this, but I threw it in here just in support of this whole, it's not really a hypothesis anymore. It's pretty much we understand that when the bacterial balance is thrown off, IBD is more likely to occur. Just in support of that, there's something called a fecal microbiota transplant, which I'm not discussing that here, but I'm just bringing that in to kind of bring out my point that this is a very central component. What they found is that when they actually implant stool from healthy species, obviously the stool is strained out and cleaned out and all that, but when they put it back transplanted into recipients, with C. diff colitis specifically, they found that that's actually a very, very powerful treatment, okay, even more effective than other treatments out there and antibiotics. Basically what they're doing is they're taking stool from healthy donors, which has the perfect balance of all these bacteria out there, which we don't really know enough about it. So, if you take the stool from a healthy donor, which I know the yuck factor is there, but at the end of the day, when people are desperate, there are people that are doing this. They'll go ahead, it's not really allowed in this country, but you can go to Europe and have it done. They go ahead and they transplant it into a recipient, and suddenly you have the perfect balance of bacteria in the gut, and the whole disease process begins to die down. So obviously this is a central component. If I would just talk about food without talking about the bacteria, it's missing half the point, okay? This is a picture of my children. One of them is up here, drinking their probiotic smoothies and holding their probiotic bottle. So it's also something you want to make sure that your kids go ahead and have probiotics in their diet as well, particularly because children are on antibiotics frequently just in general for strep, ear infections, whatever, and you don't want, particularly if they have your genetic predisposition to IBD, you want to make sure that their gut bacteria stays in good balance. That's really critical. And I would add here, even though I'm supposed to be talking about nutrition, I would add here that if you ask your doctor and the antibiotics are not absolutely necessary for your children for ear infection or something where you can go either way, I would not run to put them on it, especially if they've got your genetic predisposition to IBD. You don't want that. You want to try to minimize their risk by really keeping their gut bacteria in good balance. That's the best protection ever. Okay, so nobody really knows why the gut bacteria get thrown off balance, but overuse of antibiotics is obviously one cause. Diets high in animal protein have been associated with greater growth of bacterial strains, specifically those bacteroids that I was telling you about before, that they found higher amounts of those in people with IBD. Those are associated with diets high in animal protein versus more vegetarian plant-based diets. In general, I should throw in here, plant-based diets in all the research, meaning the more fruits, vegetables, whole grains, in general across the board have been associated with less inflammation in the gut and less risk of IBD. I'm going to throw that in more later when I caught specifically with ulcerative colitis. Okay, I wasn't able to find very, very solid evidence for this. There are some studies out there. This is obviously a hard thing to study, but severe and long-term stress has been associated, chronic stress, with changes in the gut microbiota. So controlling and managing stress is also important in this. Okay, so as far as dietary treatments, what you can actually consider doing for yourself if you're open to something like that. This is actually something that I was not aware of, the extent of it, before I did research for this. I knew of it, but I didn't realize how strong the evidence was. And actually, I was very surprised to learn that in Europe, when a kid is brought inpatient with active Crohn's into the hospital, in our country, the first line of treatment is steroids and all that. In Europe, that's not what they do. In kids, the evidence is so strong that enteral diets are basically, I would say, bring 90% of kids into remission within 2 weeks, most of them. Okay? So enteral nutrition means that the only food in the diet is in liquid form. Okay? You can think Boost, Ensure, liquid nutritional supplements. And obviously, a dietitian has to supervise to make sure that the individual is meeting their calorie and protein needs. Because if you're drinking too little and losing weight and not having enough calories, your body can't heal. It doesn't have the energy to regenerate the skin cells of the intestine and all that. But it's something to consider out there, if somebody's in a desperate situation, that there is solid evidence. I must have pulled up like 15 studies on this already, that drinking nutritional shakes solely, okay, has been shown to bring out in up to 90% of individuals remission. Okay. Now, what happens when they start to put food back in? That's obviously the question on your minds. 50% of people will relapse within 6 months. However, they found much better, lower relapse rates when people stayed away from specific foods. Believe it or not, nothing to do with sugar. They didn't find any difference between that. But when people went back onto foods after being on nutritional formulas and excluded grains like gluten or dairy or yeast, they were able to maintain their remission that was brought about from the nutritional shakes. The length of time, the standard length of treatment, it ranges. There's really not enough studies yet to know exactly what it is, but between 4 and 12 weeks. So something to consider, and what I found very interesting is that that's the first line of treatment in almost every country in the world with kids. But in our country, we don't do that. So it's just something to consider, that it's extremely effective, and I'll explain why as time goes on, based on everything that I'm going to be teaching you. At the end, you'll understand why the enteral diets probably are effective. We don't know exactly, but there was one meta-analysis where they take many studies and they look at all of it. And they found that there was actually no difference between giving this enteral nutrition, supplemental shakes, and steroid therapy with kids. And the conclusion of the authors was that there's really no, this is a better treatment approach, and you don't have all the negative side effects of steroid therapy. So something to consider. Now, we used to think, and I remember hearing about this when I was in school like 15 years ago, that Vivanex, and there's certain supplemental formulas that are already pre-digested. All the proteins are broken down. We used to think that's what the effect was. For many years, they were treating people with just feeding them Vivanex and fully broken down nutritional shakes for many weeks. But then what they found was, surprisingly enough, that when they started changing it to more palatable, tasting better options like the Ensure and the Boost, there was no difference. They had the same rates of remission. So now we kind of just say, it doesn't have to be pre-digested. Those don't taste as well, don't taste as good. The proposed mechanism, meaning why that occurs, we don't fully understand why, but we see right away when people change their diet, there's immediate changes in the balance of bacteria in the gut. Meaning when they've seen individuals, I didn't present all the research on this, but when they've put individuals on a vegetarian diet for 4 days and then they analyze the bacteria in their gut, you can see instant changes. Those bacteria are very dependent on what you're eating. So the theory is that if people are just drinking nutritional shakes, that is going to drastically change the composition of bacteria in their gut. And whatever bad bacteria they were harboring is now gone, and there's going to be changes in their disease state. And the other hypothesis of what is occurring, which I'm sure you have all been thinking about, is that it's removing whatever they're eating that they're sensitive to. You're basically, okay, there's dairy protein in there. Obviously, they're milk-based, but for a majority of people, they're removing a lot of the things that they may have an immune response to in their gut. So that's why that's going to change things. So we don't know. It's probably a combination of the two. But what we do know is that it's very effective, okay? Something to consider. I have had some clients, actually, that did it for their children. The child has to obviously be agreeable, but they gave them Boost for 4 weeks and then slowly transitioned them back onto, let's say, a gluten dairy-free diet, something like that. I'll talk a little bit more about SCD when I get there, but some kids will be more agreeable to something like that because, yeah, it's tough for 4 weeks, but then you're done and you can just do a gluten-free diet. And combined with some of the supplements I'm going to present here, the kid will be just fine. So it's just something, that's why I figured I would present it. I know it's extreme, but I figured I would present it as an option. There's one study, so some doctors are wondering, well, do we have to do this all through nutritional shakes, or can we give these kids a little bit of food? So somebody set up a study where they gave 90% of the caloric needs were met through nutritional shakes, but and they gave it actually through a tube feed overnight because they were inpatient, or even if they go home, they work that out. The other 10% they allowed them to eat just for enjoyment's sake. They allowed them to eat 10%, a little bit of food, and they achieved 65% remission rate. So that's pretty good. That was pretty good. So it's something that you might want to consider as an option if you're here to think about a child. As far as adults, if you're wondering for yourself, the evidence is pretty solid. It's not as solid as with kids, but it's pretty solid. The very high remission rates with drinking nutritional shakes. Okay, so that's one option. Let's talk about gluten, which is a biggie. Okay, I'm sure everybody's heard about gluten and the connection possibly with all sorts of ills. Now, the gliadin is basically the breakdown of gluten in your gut. As it goes through your digestive tract, it breaks down into something called gliadin. And what they found, and I gave you 2 studies there, I'm not making this up, they did find more frequent antibody levels to gliadin in the guts of people, and in the blood as well, of people with colitis and Crohn's. So there possibly is something going on there with gluten. I'm in touch with a doctor. He's actually a Frum Jew in Texas. He's a fascinating person to talk to, and his name is Dr. Kenneth Fine. He developed a stool test. He's a gastroenterologist, but he actually has colitis himself and has developed a very intense interest in this area. He's a researcher. He spends his whole day in the lab just with test tubes and all that for many years, and he's developed this stool test where he believes that if you test the stool of individuals, you can see antibodies to different proteins and in their stool. You can really identify which proteins they're really reacting to, and you can see better results that way. Instead of just eliminating randomly without knowing what people are sensitive to, you can really eliminate more specifically. So he's found, and I spoke to him on the phone before this presentation for about an hour, and he told me that from his research, which it's still pending publication, he has a lot of pushback from the medical community. He's told me what he's been through. A lot of pushback because he's a GI doctor and he's brilliant. He's a brilliant person, but the things that he wants to present are, I guess, anti what a lot of people want to believe. So he's had a lot of pushback. He's had a lot of hard time publishing his research, but he claims that he's seen double the amount of antibodies in individuals with IBD. It's about double, he claims, according to his numbers and his research. Now, everybody knows, this is actually something that even mainstream medical doctors know, that there's, in Crohn's specifically, there's increased intestinal permeability, which means that your small intestine, your stomach is, right here, and you have your small intestine coming out of it. That's where the food is absorbed into your bloodstream so that you can utilize it for whatever you need to do with your food. After that comes the large intestine. So in Crohn's, where the small intestine is affected, they've seen that the intestinal lining has almost like spaces and holes in it, that when the food comes in there, it's almost like broken up and chopped up in Crohn's. So you have whole food proteins then that are able to almost travel into the bloodstream whole. So we call this increased intestinal permeability, okay? There is a test that I can actually do, and a lot of doctors can actually do it. It's called an intestinal permeability test. They can clearly see if somebody's intestine is permeable, and they know that in Crohn's this is the case. Colitis also, sometimes it's, functional medicine practitioners like myself believe that there's leaky gut, even if you can't see it in a microscope or anything like that. There is a leaky gut even in any autoimmune problem. That's what we think is the central cause of the whole autoimmune process. But even in colitis, there's likely some leaky gut. So what we do know, bringing this in with gluten, gliadin, which is gluten, actually activates something called zonulin, which has been shown to break down the barrier of the intestine. So what we're hypothesizing here is that the gluten causes this reaction, this chemical reaction, which can start the process of developing this leaky gut. What happens once the leaky gut takes place? When the leaky gut takes place, and this is a lot brought in from the work of this Dr. Alessio Fasano, he's a very famous researcher in the field of gluten, that what happens is when you have food coming into your small intestine and these long protein chains, they're supposed to be fully broken down into single amino acids before they're absorbed. They are not supposed to get into your bloodstream whole. If you eat a bagel with cream cheese for lunch, and you have this long dairy protein from the cream cheese in your small intestine, it's going to end up in your bloodstream whole if you've got a leaky gut. And what happens is the body says, whoa, what's going on here? I have a dairy protein circulating in my bloodstream. This is a foreign body. Your immune system is supposed to attack against foreign invaders. It's going to produce an immune response. So his theory is that the immune system produces an immune response to these foods that you're eating because you've got a leaky gut that are entering up whole in your bloodstream. And these proteins that are now circulating and the immune response to them, those antibodies now circulate throughout your entire body, and that's called an autoimmune process. They can attack anything. So they're meant to fit perfectly, hand, key, and lock perfectly against the dairy protein, but we call it a cross reaction that now they circulate and they attack also your own body tissue proteins that seem similar. So antibodies are supposed to attack proteins, but if there's a protein on your own body that kind of can seem similar, it sounds a little funny, we call that a cross reaction. It can attack your own body tissues, which is this autoimmune process that takes place. So something to consider here is that because there's such strong evidence that people with Crohn's and colitis have a leaky gut, and there's a lot of research that gluten breaks down this barrier of the gut, it's definitely something to consider. And I would say it's something, if somebody's not willing to make much dietary nutritional change, I'm going to show you the leaky gut diagram in a minute. If somebody's not willing to make much nutritional changes, gluten-free, if they're willing to try that, along with some supplements and probiotics, it doesn't hurt to try. That's how I look at it. Because let's say they're not willing to do the full, nutritional shakes, SCD, GAPS. I understand that. It's very intense. But gluten-free nowadays doesn't have to be so challenging, and it's something that people can consider as an option. You don't have to do all or nothing. That's actually my most important message, is that it doesn't have to be either SCD or GAPS or nothing. There are things that you can do to heal the disease process without going so extreme. This is just showing the leaky gut, that this over here, up there is your small intestine. You've got food particles that are traveling through that small intestine, and it showing those cells when there's spaces between the cells of the small intestine. You've got those protein molecules. Well, they're actually not molecules. They're long chains of amino acids. They're large molecules that are traveling into your bloodstream whole that can really trigger an immune response. Your body doesn't know what to do with that. Okay. Just presented also that there's a bunch of different proteins that are specifically linked to Crohn's, that 74% of Crohn's patients, were not surprised by that, in their blood had an immune response to food and or microbes, meaning different bacteria. What they are finding also is that the bacteria in your gut your immune system starts to attack those bacteria in your gut as well as the foods you're eating in Crohn's. It's basically what we believe now, a lot of researchers are starting to believe, it's an immune response to what's present in your intestines, food and microbes. So, and the process starts with this leaky gut. So I just brought in a few, just to prove my point a little bit, a few more research studies here that when in Crohn's cases, they saw that with specific food proteins, there were higher immune response and blood flow in the intestines as well, which is indicative of inflammation and an immune response. Okay, I couldn't ignore this. This is so integral. I don't know how many of you who have Crohn's have actually had your ASCA levels tested. anti-Saccharomyces cerevisiae, it's specifically antibodies. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is basically yeast. I brought a picture of it in here, regular yeast that you use to make challah and all that. And what they found, interestingly enough, is that 50 to 60% of people with Crohn's have antibodies to this yeast in their gut. Not everybody, but 60% is a substantial number. Now, it's actually such a substantial number that we use that as a marker of Crohn's, meaning when we want to identify is it Crohn's, is it colitis, that's one of the pieces of the puzzle that doctors take. If somebody's got ASCA, that's pointing them in the direction of Crohn's. It's a very specific, it's not specific only to Crohn's, but it's very strongly associated with Crohn's. Now, what that tells us is that, now what they found, I'm going to go on this in a different slide, but when they took gluten out of people's diets with Crohn's, they found that these antibodies to yeast also died down, interestingly enough. Probably, according to what I've been presenting, when the gut heals a little bit and there's less leaky gut, all the immune responses that start to occur when you have a leaky gut die down. So if you have immune responses to egg and dairy and yeast and all these foods, once the leaky gut is healed, when you take out gluten for many months, slowly the immune responses likely can die down. Candida albicans is a yeast, a fungus that, I'm sure you've heard about this. It's something that commonly grows in the gut, and it has been isolated more frequently in Crohn's cases as well. Now, people that have diets high in carbs and sugars, we know that feeds yeast. You put sugar with your yeast when you're starting it to make challah. It is important to feed the yeast. So in theory, when you take out carbs and sugar, it should reduce the populations of yeast. It never works that way fully, though. You need to also look at the whole picture. Like I said, if people have a leaky gut, they're going to have antibodies to yeast no matter what. So you have to heal the leaky gut. But it's something to consider that I like to have people test their ASCA levels in their stool. And if it comes back high, I always recommend taking yeast out of the diet, especially in Crohn's, specifically in Crohn's. Okay. Now, there was one study here that they did. They took Crohn's patients. They followed their usual diet. In the second and third months, they went on a yeast-free diet. They gave them capsules. Some of them were taking yeast in their capsules, and some were given placebo. And in the group that was taking baker's yeast, they had a significantly higher Crohn's activity index, which is just a measure of how active the Crohn's is. Now, we also see, by the way, this high ASCA levels, these antibodies to yeast, in people with celiac as well. So, and we saw that when we took people off of gluten in celiac cases, those ASCA levels went down. So there's a link between the gluten and the yeast, but it's something to consider. I've had people say, let me just try a gluten and yeast-free diet, and some people have had results. I'm going to talk about in a minute, the different options out there, and I want to give some disclaimers that what works for one doesn't work for the next, and I've seen that firsthand, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay, so I basically went through that. The ASCA is linked to the leaky gut. Okay, vitamin D. I don't know if anybody's doctors have mentioned to them that it's very important now. They're finding vitamin D is basically linked to almost everything out there. And specifically us from Jews, are very low in vitamin D, probably because we're always covered up, especially in the summer. Vitamin D is the sun hormone. It's not a vitamin, it's actually a hormone that you really need it very much for almost there's vitamin D receptors on almost every cell in your body. And if you don't have enough vitamin D, things can go wrong. So, and I think they've also found that specifically Ashkenazim have they call it a genetic polymorphism, that we do not process vitamin D the same way, and therefore we're more likely to be low. Okay, so there's a large body of research that has linked vitamin D specifically to autoimmunity, that when the body attacks itself, it plays some sort of central component here. It's very common in IBD, and it's independently associated with a higher disease activity in Crohn's. They did an Israeli study. Of course, a bunch of Jewish people in Israel wanted to see, because there's so much Crohn's and colitis within our community, they wanted to see and there's also so much low vitamin D deficiency, they wanted to analyze the connection. And they did find that people that have this genetic polymorphism, they call it, where they are more likely to have low vitamin D levels because of something in their genes. They did have more susceptibility to developing ulcerative colitis when they looked at a large population of people. There was another study that showed that low vitamin D can make a leaky gut, okay? I usually recommend that people take 5,000 IU a day of vitamin D. I like people to have it tested when they're running blood work anyways, and I know the lab work, people just see that it's not bolded on their blood tests, And they say, oh, I think I was fine. My doctor didn't tell me anything. I always say, just because your doctor didn't tell you anything, get a copy of the results, look at it yourself. Meaning, if it's it'll tell you between 30 and 100 is fine. You really want it more like 60 to 80, even 60 to 90. Okay, you want it up there if you have IBD. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about supplements, and then I'm going to get into the SCD, the GAPS, the paleo diet. So supplements, curcumin, which is a derivative of turmeric, that yellow spice that you might have in your cabinet. A lot of people found that, they were finding that it was helpful. So I wanted to actually look at research studies on that. There was actually solid support for it. I was pretty surprised that it's a very interesting finding that they're finding that 2,000 milligrams a day for 6 months they did in the studies. They had much lower relapse rates. They weren't studying it as meaning bringing on remission. They studied it more with people that were okay and stable, and they found in the long run they had lower remission rates, which makes sense because curcumin is a very, very potent anti-inflammatory, and we know that inflammation is a big part of the disease process in IBD. L-glutamine, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of L-glutamine. L-glutamine is basically, it comes in capsule form. It's very cheap. It's very simple. When they found that in rats, there's no studies in humans, but I included it because there's so much talk about L-glutamine in the functional medicine community that I figured it was worth bringing this in, even though they don't have any human studies. They did find that when they induced colitis artificially in rats and then gave them L-glutamine, there was less damage to their intestinal lining. In fact, they found that I think there was basically no damage to their intestinal lining at all. I usually recommend, because it's so cheap and why not, 3,000 to 5,000 milligrams of L-glutamine a day. There was insufficient evidence for omega-3 fish oils. Now, there were some studies that showed a benefit to taking fish oils. I don't think there were enough. I think there was maybe one. It was poorly designed. And when they had meta-analysis, when they looked at lots of studies, I mean, it can't hurt. But if you're on a tight budget and you want to know exactly what you should be taking that will help, I would point you more in the direction of the L-glutamine, the curcumin, and the probiotics. Now, there's plenty of other things out there that I did not include, just in the interest of time. There's aloe vera juice, which you can get that like in any health food store. They actually have it in capsule form. There's diglyceride licorice. If you want, you can come over to me afterwards, but they have capsules where they combine diglyceride licorice with aloe and marshmallow root that anecdotally, I would say, I haven't really looked up all the research on it. I don't think there's enough for me to come to any conclusions, but anecdotally has been shown to be very, very helpful with reducing the inflammation in the gut and bringing down the disease state. Just a few more proven dietary risk factors. What they have found is eating a lot of meat and fats has been associated with a higher risk of Crohn's and colitis. More fruits and vegetables are basically associated with a lower risk. Fruits specifically with Crohn's, vegetables with colitis. I don't know if there's, how significant that is, but basically you got to get your plant foods up. Now I'm going to talk about this this is more for prevention. Once a person has Crohn's already and there's strictures present, I always tell people that you absolutely cannot be doing high fiber, because if something gets stuck, and you're at high risk of an obstruction if you have high fiber foods. So, until I always say if there's strictures present, it's absolutely the opposite. In fact, taking in half of your food with nutritional shakes like Boost and Ensure is probably really good in that case. But you do want to go ahead and make sure that you have a balanced diet and enough calories and all that. I would say more of a low fiber diet at that point, once you progress to that point, is necessary, which most of you probably know. Your doctors, if it's occurred, you probably know that. But for prevention in family members and all that, you want to make sure you have a high in fruits and vegetables. Okay, so talking about, and I should point out as well that if there are no strictures, but somebody wants to get a better handle on their Crohn's as far as inflammation and ulcering and all that, I usually recommend a diet high in fruits and vegetables, but cooked. Cooked is much easier to tolerate, specifically cooked and blended soups and fruits and vegetables, much better tolerated than raw. That I would try to increase specifically because of its anti-inflammatory effects. Okay, so talking about the specific carbohydrate diet, which I'm sure is basically the only diet most of you have ever heard about linked to Crohn's. The hypothesis of why it works, it was developed by Dr. Sidney Haas, and it was publicized by Elaine Gottschall, who wrote the book Breaking the Vicious Cycle. And her daughter had colitis, and it was very severe, and she healed her through this diet and publicized it, and a lot of the credit is due to her. She's no longer alive, but she had a lot of writings and students that she taught, and a lot of people follow the SCD diet and do see results. So the hypothesis, based on a lot of what I presented, you can now understand maybe why it would work. And I have my own hypotheses of why it would work. Nobody really knows why it works. Is that when you have, what she said, is that when you have the wrong type of bacteria, like I explained, overgrowing, they produce these toxins in your gut, and they also produce a lot of different mucus, these bacteria. That mucus makes it that there's a barrier between the enzymes that break down your food and the food. So you can't fully break down sugars anymore. So what starts to happen is that any sugars that are in long chains that are not fully broken down just sit there in long chains. And those bacteria now that produce these toxins and mucus, they go ahead and eat the sugars, and they proliferate, and they produce even more toxins, which are more damaging to your gut. This is all a theory. This is not proven. This is what, if you read the Breaking the Vicious Cycle, I basically summarize the first 6 chapters. That's what's going on, okay? That's her theory. Now, what happens is, the solution, she says, is consume any sugars, specifically carbohydrates, that are in single molecule form, okay? Basically, fructose, glucose, galactose are single molecule form sugars. Nothing that needs to be is in 2 molecules together or 3 molecules together. That way it doesn't have to be broken down at all. So fructose, like fruit sugars and honey, which is predominantly fructose, would be, according to this theory, fine, because these bacteria then cannot feed off of long molecules. And there's those single molecules, those don't need any enzymes to break them down. They're absorbed 1, 2, 3, and then therefore slowly these bacteria will die out. And when these bacteria die out, like we said, the dangerous bacteria that are causing this whole disease process to begin with, when they die out, you start to have an improvement in symptoms. So what would the specific carbohydrate diet include? I'll get to in a minute, but there was really unfortunately not that many studies conducted on the SCD diet. There was one I found that 9 children, which I think they could have done a better job on that. They could have gotten a larger population so that people would actually respect this study more. Unfortunately, your doctors are not going to respect it until there's research on it, which is probably why they don't, okay? But they had one study done with 9 children. They were on SCD for a year with medication at the same time. And they were not really comparing it, unfortunately, either against any other group. I was disappointed to see that they didn't do that. But their Crohn's disease activity index did decrease significantly from 0 to 12 weeks, and then from 12 to 52 weeks. They saw it going down on the SCD diet. That's the only study I was able to pull up. Obviously, there's a lot of anecdotal research. People have had tremendous success with this diet. I have to point out that a lot of people have not had. So if you are one of those that did not have success with it, don't feel disappointed. You're not the only one. There are people that do not have success with it. I sometimes wonder why sometimes certain diets work for others, for one, and certain don't work for the other. What I think it is that when your bacterial balance is thrown off, you could have 1, 2, or 3 really bad strains of bacteria overgrowing in your gut, that if you go on the SCD diet, yeah, it will change the composition of bacteria in your gut, but it might for one person work and not for the other, just because you have certain strains that don't respond when you cut out carbs. They just are still able to thrive, and that's why it might not work. So we do know, though, like I presented already, that IBD is very much linked to you're having an immune response to the bacteria in your gut and to the foods you're eating. So when you change your diet, automatically your bacteria, the gut bacteria changes, the food changes, you're going to see results. Whether SCD is the perfect approach for you, it might not work, but there's other approaches as well. You can try taking out gluten, taking out yeast. You can try the nutritional shakes approach. There are other approaches which have solid evidence as well that you can try. I just put in here further controlled studies with larger population samples are needed. Hopefully they'll get there eventually. What would SCD allow? It would allow, obviously proteins have no carbs, no sugars, so that's fine. Most vegetables are fine. Butternut squash would be allowed. Sweet potatoes are too many chains of long sugars, that would not be allowed. Butternut squash, the only reason why it would be allowed, even though it is a little starchy, is because the composition of how the sugars are composed, they're still able to be broken down even without the enzymes working well. Specific beans, I wrote there, navy, kidney, and black beans, they need to be soaked, so a lot of the starches end up being poured out in the water. Proteins are okay, nuts and seeds. I mean, you can get the book, Breaking the Vicious Cycle, but and there's also websites, SCD legal, okay? You can go on and type in any food and it will tell you legal or not legal if you have a question. I think there's apps nowadays as well. You can literally scan a food and it will tell you legal or not. Dairy, the only dairy that would be allowed, lactose is a long chain of sugars. So if you don't have the enzymes, like we know, lactose intolerance, if you can't break it down because of that mucus in the way, you can't break it down, you have to stay away from that. So the only thing that would be allowed from the dairy group would be farmer and cheddar cheese, which is pretty much no lactose left in it by the time they're done processing it, and yogurt that you ferment, which part of the diet is very important. Fermenting your own yogurt for 24 hours to break down every last bit of lactose to its free form of amino acids. Of sugars, I meant to say. So basically, that's the SCD diet in a nutshell. They would not allow sugar. Sugar is a double molecule, two sugars connected. And you wouldn't be able, in theory, according to this, to break it down. Prebiotics would not be allowed as well on this. A lot of people don't know that. Prebiotics feed bacteria. They're going to feed the bad guys too as well. So you have to be very careful with that. Grains would not be allowed. Potatoes, sweet potatoes, they're long chains of sugars. Basically, long chains of sugars are not allowed. Simple sugars like fruits and honey are allowed. Vegetables and proteins have no sugars and carbs. They're fine. That's the SCD diet. Again, lots of results, lots of success with it. A lot of people do not have, in which case I would say let's take a look at some supplements and some, other things. Now, a lot of people believe, okay, and this is something that I've considered as well, aside from the SCD diet probably being much higher in fruits and vegetables and therefore changing the gut bacteria, that could be one reason really why it works. The whole theory of Elaine Gottschall and Dr. Haas, that it was the whole, the sugars connected that you can't break down causing it, it may hold it may not really have any evidence for that. It may not really be true. Really what could be going on is that you're changing the bacteria in your gut by eating more fruits and vegetables. That's one theory. B, when you're going on SCD, you're automatically eliminating gluten. That's another thing that you have to consider. Maybe that's really what's going on here. You're eliminating gluten, okay? So it's just something to consider that it may not be, if it works, it may not be because of the reasons why we believe it is, in which case it might work just increasing fruits and vegetables and going off of gluten, if indeed that's really what's going on, which we don't know, okay? That could also be why some people respond and some don't. Maybe some people increase their fruits and vegetables more than others on SCD, okay? So we don't really know what's going on. We know it's sometimes very, very effective and sometimes not. There's another diet which is very similar to SCD. It's called the GAPS diet. It's a takeoff of SCD. I would say the central differences are, it's very similar. I'm just going to point out the differences in it. That you must include a cup of bone broth with every meal. Bone broth, I actually recommend this for everybody that has IBD. This is something that you can be doing. It's very healing. You take a bunch of different types of bones, meat, turkey, chicken bones, vegetables and spices like chicken soup. The only difference is you use bones and you cook it for 18 to 24 hours. The bones release lots of different compounds which are glue to the intestinal lining and allow it to heal back up. So that GAPS diet, they recommend you drinking a cup of that 2 or 3 times a day. So that's something I recommend as well. They say that you must include fermented foods for the reasons that I described before. It's so important for the balance of bacteria in the gut. And it does allow a little bit more cheeses, like Munster, Parmesan. SCD doesn't really allow much of that. Maybe a bite here and there, they say, but not much. The other difference, which in the interest of time, I didn't do this here. You can go on gapsdiet.com. There's a 6-stage introductory diet, especially when somebody's in an acute inflammatory attack phase of IBD, that you start out with literally just broth and it progresses from one thing to the next until they bring you into the full diet. That's another difference. SCD has something similar, but it's even more restrictive with GAPS. Okay. The last approach that I've shared, this is not very popular. It's more restrictive than GAPS and SCD. A lot of people swear by it, okay, but it's extremely restrictive. It's called the Paleo Autoimmune Protocol. There's a bunch of books on this. Basically, what it allows is fruits, vegetables, and proteins. It's pretty much it. No nuts and no eggs, which are allowed on SCD. So that is very challenging. I'll tell you, a typical SCD patient of mine will come in, and what are they eating? Because they're allowed to have nuts and eggs, that's a big foundation of the diet. Out of almond flour and eggs, they'll make a bunch of different types of muffins and, sweetened by honey and fruit. That's pretty easy. If you can have muffins and bread, I mean, not easy, but easier than this. This is no nuts, no eggs really limits you. You're basically eating protein, vegetables, and fruits. But the Paleo Autoimmune Protocol specifically encourages, it's not just about what's not allowed. What they do encourage is that the meats should be quality, okay, like grass-fed, healthy, organic, because what has been associated with IBD is having more omega-6 fats in your diet versus omega-3 fats. And we know that the grass-fed beef that are walking around and getting exercise and eating grass, they have more omega-3 in their fats in the meat. So that's encouraged with the paleo diet. Quality fats are also encouraged. Fatty fish, olive, avocado, even fats from grass-fed beef. And it also encourages probiotic foods as well and fermented foods. And also very important in the paleo diet, you can get books on the subject as well, is including a lot of organ meats, like specifically liver, organ meats that are very healing, they believe, to the gut lining, okay? Nightshades are not as well allowed as well in the paleo, I should point out. Nightshades are tomatoes, potatoes, eggplant, and peppers. So that's very limiting. When you're not allowed all that stuff, it's extremely challenging. I have had maybe 2 people that ever agreed to try it, ever. And I even remember specifically who they were, and they did see great results with it, but it was challenging. So I mean, people who are desperate might want to try this for 6 months and then kind of transition over to something a little bit more liberalized like SCD, and eventually transition over maybe to gluten-free, yeast-free. I'm just presenting all the options. It's very hard to know what will work for one person. That's my main message. So I want to present all the options so that you're free to try and not just feel that it's just SCD and nothing else. I just wanted to present my own conclusions here. I know this is not evidence-based, but this is just my own thinking. The gut microbiota, that's definitely that is, evidence-based, that it's very central component here. You change the gut balance of bacteria in the gut, the whole thing disappears. That's something that hopefully we'll know more in 10, 15 years from now. We'll know how to do that. We don't really know now, but we just know that that's really the cause almost, okay? And IBD really is an immune response to the bacteria and the food in your gut. It is, because that's when you change that, we see people healing up. So a lot of doctors, the reason why they don't present the nutritional aspect is A, they never were taught, so they don't really know, and B, unfortunately, there's just not a lot of evidence out there yet for it. So I'm hoping that they're going to be doing more research on the SCD diet, gluten yeast-free diets, which I presented some research, but it's just still not enough for the doctors to come behind it and support it. The enteral feeds that I was presenting in the beginning, drinking nutritional shakes only, the SCD, the GAPS, and the Paleo, what do they all have in common? They're going to change the balance of bacteria in your gut. Like I said, change your diet, change the bacteria. But they're all eliminating gluten. Almost every single one of them I present is eliminating gluten, and they're eliminating SCD, GAPS, Paleo. There's no yeast. If you think about it that way, there is no yeast. There's no bread. So how are you getting yeast in your diet? There's really no way to get yeast in. And they're also eliminating other food antigens. SCD does not eliminate dairy. And neither does GAPS, but the paleo diet does. So it could be that the reason why these things are working is not because of the, what they had said, the reason why it works, but more just because you're eliminating these food antigens. That's just some of my own thinking. Practically speaking, all I want you to know is that there are many approaches, and you should be open to trying any. If all you can do is gluten-free, yeast-free with some of the supplements I recommended, you may see results from that alone. Okay, so I'm going to take some questions now. If anybody has, and then I included my contact info if you want to email me if you have any questions afterwards. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, I'm just going to give you the mic. She wanted to. We can hear you.
First of all, thank you very much. This has been very informative. I don't think it's working, but that's okay. Excuse me. This has been very informative. I wish I had heard this many years ago. Okay. Question for you, supplements, side effects. Are there any, isn't curcumin associated with blood thinning? And I know personally with probiotics, I had a problem, I got a mouth yeast infection from taking probiotics. So what do you suggest in terms of figuring out, is there such a thing as too much probiotics?
Okay, so good question. So curcumin, garlic, there's a few things that are known blood thinners. That's a good question. What I want to give a disclaimer is that, What I want to say is, her question was, are there any side effects that we should be aware of of nutritional supplements? There are omega-3 fish oils, garlic, and curcumin are blood thinners. So it's contraindicated if somebody's on a blood thinner, Coumadin, all that. I should mention any supplement you're going to take, you want to first approve with your doctor or anybody else, any other health professional. You definitely don't want to go ahead and take anything without asking. Probiotics, I'm surprised to hear that you got a mouth yeast infection from that. It could be, I don't know what the whole background, what was going on at the same time, but probiotics are the most widely studied supplements and the most safe, probably the safest supplement out there. Almost nobody has any side effects from that. Now there are situations, like I work a lot with IBS cases, where people get more gassy and bloated from probiotics. That is common, and that, I didn't present about IBS today, but that's because, and there's a real solid scientific reason why that might happen. I don't know what the situation was with you with the mouth yeast, but usually when you take a good type of yeast, I was mentioning Saccharomyces cerevisiae as a bad yeast in the gut. There's a good one called Saccharomyces boulardii, which most probiotic strains don't have, that when people have yeast issues, candida, fungal toenails, yeast infections, thrush, things like that, I recommend that they're taking that specific strain because it combats that type of yeast. So I don't know what went on with you. Maybe you had recently been on antibiotics and it was kind of like at the same time you went on probiotics and it was really more due to the antibiotics and you were associating it with the probiotics. It's very unlikely to me that the probiotics cause the mouth yeast infection. Probiotics are very safe, but definitely you always want to clear things with your doctor. Probiotics are very safe though. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, can you just repeat the name of that one you just said? That good name of
Probiotic.
yeast?
Oh, okay. The
long
good yeast is called Saccharomyces. If you look at the slides, I had Saccharomyces cerevisiae. This one is called Saccharomyces boulardii. Boulardi. That's another just good strain of yeast, which doesn't hurt. They didn't actually study it in Crohn's, but being that Crohn's is associated with an overgrowth of candida, the bad yeast, and antibodies to Baker's yeast, it doesn't hurt to take the good yeast to try to kill out whatever else is in there that's bad. Yeah, any other questions?
You mentioned that gluten or breakdown product of gluten can trigger the leaky gut disease. So what's the balance for people who don't have Crohn's, who might get Crohn's, in terms of eating, breads and grains and so forth?
Okay, so I think your question is that if somebody doesn't have Crohn's yet and gluten is associated with leaky gut, what would I say about that? Meaning, is there something that we should be thinking about already before somebody develops IBD as far as prevention? What I would say is when I see like families that have a lot of IBD and stomach issues, which that happens all the time because somebody comes to me and then their brother and their aunt and their cousin and their daughter and their sister, and you see like what's going on here. There's obviously, we know that there's a genetic predisposition to this. It's probably very likely that the reason why this whole family has something going on, it's very possible that they all have some sort of, deficiency in how they break down gluten, which can cause incomplete breakdown in gluten, and therefore they have immune responses to it. There's a lot of different types of genes that it can interplay and cause it. What I would say is I would never take a kid or somebody off of gluten unless they're really willing, very agreeable, doesn't bother them really that much, it's kind of easy. It's a big thing to take gluten out of a diet, it really is. So I wouldn't take anybody off of it unless you go ahead and see that it's something that's easy for them, but I would consider, if there's a strong family component, I would consider, just making everybody make sure that they limit gluten, possibly. There's also different, I don't really recommend these, but there are supplements you can take before you have gluten that can fully break it down better and minimize the negative repercussions. There are. I don't really give them out, but there are products out there. So what I usually say is if somebody's just doing it preventative, like they think that they don't do as well on gluten, maybe it makes them have headaches, maybe they get a brain fog, which is common, that after they eat gluten, they feel like they can't focus, and there's a strong family predisposition to IBD, and they want to just go off of it preventative, I would say, okay, you can try it, and before you eat gluten at a birthday party or maybe you want challah just on Shabbos, you can take this supplement to fully break it down. There is something to be said, though, of going off of it preventative, but I don't really encourage that necessarily, unless somebody comes to me and they're open to it. Okay? Any other questions?
I was just wondering, what do you think about the Ensure liquid supplement with the SCD diet as well? Can we combine it, or because it's dairy or whatever?
Okay, so SCD would, Ensure would be absolutely not SCD legal because it has sugar, okay? So if you want to do SCD, I would say do SCD all the way, okay? Now, those two wouldn't go together. Remember I was presenting that if you do 90% of the diet as Ensure or Boost, and then 10% of food, they did see results. So what I would say is if you want to try something, you can do 4 weeks, maybe 8 weeks of 90% nutritional shakes with a little bit of food. I would probably stay off of gluten and yeast though, because if it's Crohn's, because that's so strongly linked to to Crohn's, okay? If it's colitis, I would stay off of gluten for sure. Try nutritional shakes and see if it works, okay? And then slowly transition into a regular gluten yeast-free diet. You can try that. But if you want to try SCD, there's no point being restricted with SCD and then including things that SCD claims are not allowed. That doesn't go, yeah. Meaning it has sugar and it has other things in there that SCD would absolutely not allow, so yeah.
So I guess going with that, you mentioned the liquid diet of the Ensure and a Boost. What about any non-dairy nutritional drinks, or like that you make homemade with either soy-based or plant-based protein instead of drinking the ones that, and they have so many chemicals
Right.
also.
I hear you, yeah. Okay, so the research was showing results with Ensure and Boost. So what I would say is if somebody wants to make their own more natural and healthy drinks, which I hear you, I would try to, as much as possible, nobody really knows the answer of is it liquid diet that helps? Nobody knows why it helps. We theorize that it's because you're changing the gut back. I mentioned why it might work. You're changing the composition of bacteria in your gut, and you're probably getting rid of a lot of antigens. Now, the only antigen, the only protein that it includes in there that could potentially be a problem is dairy. So what I would say is if you want to make your own shakes, okay, I would include fats, no problem, like avocado, fruits, no problem, okay, because those are not proteins. But I would not include any other proteins aside from dairy, and that would be the most similar way to replicate these shakes. These shakes are basically, what they are milk protein, okay? They've got corn syrup, which is not necessary, you know, it just improves taste, palatability. They've got sugar, okay? So you're asking me if you switch out sugar and use something like honey or stevia, will you have the same results that they saw in the studies? There's really no way for me to know that and answer that. I would assume that it would not be a problem, that you would still have the same results they've seen, because really, honestly, I think the reason why they've seen results with these things is because the only protein in those shakes is dairy. So that, you know, if you get out every other protein in your diet that you could be reacting to, and the only protein is dairy, if you do that with a shake, and the only protein in there is dairy, and you've got some fat sources maybe, like avocado, I would not include nuts, because nuts have proteins in them as well that you could potentially be reacting to. I would not include that. To replicate it, I would just include a fat source, like avocado, a dairy. To sweeten it, I would honestly use sugar, because you want to replicate what they had used, which was sugar. Okay, you want to make it almost exactly the same, just less chemicals, right? That's what you're trying to accomplish. Fruit is sugar. Now, we don't know yet, though, if the fructose in fruit might be bothering some people. So what I would say is you're better off keeping it as simple as possible if you want to make your own shakes. Maybe a little vanilla bean, a dairy source, sugar, avocado, and then it would be almost exactly the same as their Ensure and Boost, just they're putting in vitamins and minerals, so you'd have to take a bunch of supplements to meet your needs. And then it would be basically almost the same thing, a more natural form. But I would not include anything that has protein in it, like nuts. What other protein might you put in? No protein
like
powders,
soy?
no
Yeah,
soy protein powders,
really?
because if you want to replicate their studies and they saw results with this, try to make it almost exactly the same. That's the way I would look at it. Nobody really knows why it worked, remember. Nobody knows why it worked, we just know it did work. So if you want to make your own version, make it exactly the same. I would be careful with the fruit. I would be careful with the fruit just because you want it, if you want it to replicate it, they had no fructose going on in there. You start putting fruit in it now, you're not comparing apples to apples anymore. You want it to be exactly the same. Understand? Okay, and so I guess what I would do if you were my client, I would sit down with you and say, okay, let's look online, let's try to figure out a recipe that'll taste good, and let's make our own little shake that is almost similar to Boost and Ensure as far as fat, protein, sugar, whatever it is, but excludes all the same proteins they're excluding. And also you have to make sure you're meeting your nutritional needs. If you're not meeting your needs, you can't heal. Your body needs extra calories in order to heal. Okay? Any other questions?
Yes.
Okay. Do you want me to another minute or two? Or okay, we'll take like 2 or 3 more questions, and then afterwards you can ask me on your own.
With IBD and IBS, you mentioned about increasing vitamin D.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, for IBS, would you also say to increase vitamin D and to stay away from gluten and yeast?
Okay, so I'm not here to speak about IBS. That's a whole presentation in and of itself. And by the way, IBS really doesn't mean anything to me anymore. It just means you have a wacky stomach and we don't know what it is. It's not IBD, so we're just going to call it IBS. That's what IBS means. There can be probably, from my perspective, 50 different things that can be wrong when you have quote-unquote IBS. It could be you have an overgrowth of bacteria in your small intestine. It could be something like a gluten yeast sensitivity. because there's so many different causes of it, I can't answer that question with like one solution. What I usually like to do is to test and see specifically what could it be why your stomach is quote unquote wacky, and try to fix that. Rather, that's not such an easy thing to do. But so answering if you should go off of gluten and yeast, I never just take somebody off of gluten and yeast just because they have quote unquote IBS. No. I don't think there's any evidence also between vitamin D and IBS. I don't think so. I haven't looked at it, but I know vitamin D and IBD and autoimmunity, yes. I don't think there's any evidence. What I would say is if your vitamin D levels are low, get them up. It can't hurt. Can't hurt in anyways. You want them up anyways because it's associated so strongly with lower rates of cancer and all that. And every process in your body needs it. So it doesn't hurt to get it up. Whether that's going to be the answer to IBS, I don't think so. No, there's a lot more going on usually. Somebody else had a question?
I heard you say in the beginning something about gluten-free and dairy-free, and then the rest of the presentation I keep hearing you saying gluten-free and yeast-free. And I also heard you say all or not. It's not all or nothing. So if we want to start somewhere without adding too many specifications, would you say that it would be a good place to leave the dairy or leave the dairy in? And the other thing I just want to add about the vitamin D is because without any scientific evidence, I could just tell you that my child who has Crohn's, the two places he does best is in Miami, in sun, and in camp all summer. And the only thing that's the same is that he's outside of vitamin D.
Yeah, vitamin D there's such strong evidence for with IBD, so it's very possible. When I had mentioned the dairy word, okay, I was trying to actually stay away from that because dairy is a very big thing to exclude from a diet. I mean, for me, if I was taken off of gluten, I could handle it. If I was taken off of dairy, I would feel very restricted. Just because dairy is cheese, pizza, it's ice cream. It's just a lot of foods that are very important. So what I would say is I would start with gluten-free. What I like to do, honestly, is I like to have people do this Dr. Fine's test. Very pricey. You can do it yourself. You don't need to do it with a doctor or a dietitian. It's called, I should probably stand in the front. It's called Entero Lab. If you want to write it down, ENTEROLAB. ENTEROLAB.
No.
You could do it yourself. It's a little hard to interpret what to do with the results once you get it. That's why people like to come to me and do it under my supervision. Basically, I know that there's a problem in Maryland. Maryland has a lot of laws. It's just political. They don't let you do business with out-of-state labs. They want to keep all your business for labs in New York State, in Maryland and New York. So it's a little tricky. If you want to do it with this lab, it's basically you collect a stool sample and send it back. They can actually test exactly what you're reacting to, because what you're asking is, should I include, where should I start? They can test what they see immune responses to, and that's the best way to know what to exclude from your diet. The test is $550, so I don't always do it if budget is a consideration. But if you're willing to spend, I would just recommend before you exclude dairy. See, excluding gluten, you can try it for 3 months, and if it doesn't work, you didn't lose that much unless it's something really hard for you. Excluding gluten and dairy, I would say at that point, I usually recommend testing first. I never just like to take anybody off of gluten and dairy without testing first. When I had mentioned the dairy word in the beginning, it was because I was mentioning that when people have tried different diets, that's just something that the researchers saw that people were just trying. I didn't present, if you notice, I didn't present any studies that showed they took people off of dairy and they saw improvements in IBD. I didn't really find that much for that. I did see that they saw that there was more reaction to proteins across the board. When they tested gluten, dairy, nuts, eggs, they saw overall, in Crohn's cases, more of a reaction. I didn't find any actual study that said they took a group with Crohn's, a group without, they took them off of dairy, this group not, and they had better results. So that's why I just kind of mentioned it in passing that it's something people anecdotally try. There was no solid evidence for it. But I do believe that some people do have an immune response to it. And when they actually take things that they're reacting to out of their diet, they have better results. So that's why I'd like to do this test. If you're in Maryland and you have this situation, they're legally required to destroy your sample if it gets there. So you're wasting your time. What I usually suggest to my clients that are in New York or Maryland is that you somehow have to get your sample, it's frozen, the sample, and it's in this package that keeps it frozen. You have to get it over to a different state and somebody sends it out from the UPS box there. So I have clients in Muncie that will drive to New Jersey, postal, UPS, or whatever, and send it out from there, and then they will process your sample.
Is Dr. Fine the only one who does this? Because Genova Diagnostics is not a problem from here.
Right, so Genova Diagnostics doesn't have, I use them a lot. I use a lot of their tests. They have an IgG. This is a little bit going more than I'm plan to present, but they have an IgG blood test where they actually test for IgG antibodies in the blood to foods. I have not seen good results with that at all. There's not enough evidence for it. I stopped doing it years ago. I don't like it. It doesn't work. I've seen amazing results with his stool testing, where you actually are testing, it's called IgA antibodies. It's a different type of antibody that when they're testing, let's say, celiac panel on LabCorp or Quest, they're looking for IgA antibodies to gluten in your blood, okay? Now, what he claims is that, yeah, it's nice in your blood. It doesn't always show up in the blood at that point. Like in your stool where the food is actually present, you can actually see IgA antibodies in your stool. Genova has no test like that. No, they do not have an IgA. It's a very innovative test that he's doing. I just wish that he would get his research published already and that doctors would become more on board with it, but there's a lot of pushback, and I think that's really honestly why it hasn't been the research has not been published and all that. I think it's just political. But I definitely have seen improvement with my clients with it. So even though there's no quote-unquote solid evidence yet, I still do the test. But I do use a lot of Genova's tests for Crohn's cases as well. They have a great test you can ask a local doctor who's participating with Genova Diagnostics to do for you. It's called the GI Effects. I do that stool test with some of my clients. I just have to be under the supervision of a doctor because I'm not a doctor, I'm a dietitian. But I have a doctor that supervises me, and we order this test. It's called GI Effects. It can basically tell you if you don't have enough digestive enzymes that are breaking down foods. Clinically, I don't find it that useful because basically what I started finding is that everybody that had Crohn's, yeah, they had low diversity in their strains of bacteria. Yeah, they had low of the firmicutes. So, but practically speaking, why do you have to pay money to see that? Like you can just take the probiotic. You know you have low diversity. I didn't find that it was changing the actual clinically what I was doing. So if insurance wasn't covering it, I didn't find it was a good usage of money. What I would say, this test is a good usage of money, like Dr. Fine's Intero Lab test. So, and you can do that on your own. You don't need any doctor to order it. Okay, any other questions? Okay. And then this will be the last one, yeah.
I just want to know, like, all the testing for Crohn's that you've mentioned in regards to the fecal and the doctor from Texas, is that also good for colitis?
Yes, it's all one and the same. Honestly, she wanted to know if all this lab testing is also applicable to colitis. Honestly, from a functional medicine perspective, I keep saying functional medicine. That means basically us practitioners that believe in looking at evidence-based medicine and believe in looking at research, not just making things up. But we want to look at the body as a whole. That it's not just one localized systems. You're one body. We do believe that colitis and Crohn's all stem from the same source, and believe it or not, any autoimmune, anywhere in the body, stems from a leaky gut. So the treatment approach would be very similar for any autoimmune problem, meaning if somebody's got, I don't know, psoriasis, which is a whole thing in and of itself, it doesn't always work as simple. Honestly, IBD is easier to cure than psoriasis, but basically if somebody's got any autoimmune problem anywhere in the body, it's because their gut is leaking. So it would be one and the same. The treatment approach would be, let's try to figure out what bacteria are thrown off, get rid of anything that's making your gut leaky or any immune responses to foods, put in some new bacteria that are good. Also, we want to, by the way, another component here in healing your gut, which I didn't bring in here because I didn't want to go so much into supplements because it gets very complicated. It's not something I feel that I can just tell you what to do. Just try this, try that. I want it to be something that if you have specific questions about supplements, you're better off working with a dietitian who knows what they're doing or emailing me, something like that. But basically, if you have colitis or Crohn's, you want to get rid of the food that you're reacting to. You want to get rid of gluten specifically. Okay, you want to replace any missing bacteria that you might be missing. And you also want to use a third component is you want to give yourself products that specifically have been shown to heal the lining of the gut. Like I had mentioned aloe in passing. The bone broth is very healing, L-glutamine. So that's a central component. It's like a three-legged stool, I like to look at it. The bacteria, fix that up, food antigens, and the other component is give yourself things that actually heal the gut. Okay, so with both Crohn's and colitis, yes. Okay, thank you very much. And I just want to leave one disclaimer that what works for one does not work for the next. I see that across the board. Like don't expect oh, I'm going to try SCD and I'll have results. I'll try the yeast gluten-free with the supplements and I'm going to see results. I've seen phenomenal stories, like people are in remission within a week, within not doing nothing, and I've seen people do everything. They've done Paleo Autoimmune with probiotics and with every supplement out there, and they still cannot achieve remission. So it's very individualized, very varied, but I would venture to say that 90% of people with IBD that try something nutritionally will see some improvement. I'm not promising you'll go off of meds, but you'll see some improvement. So it's definitely something that you don't want to just dismiss. It's not SED or nothing. It's not like that. Okay? And that's it.
Thank you.